Hey everybody, day 46. Today I was out of the classroom working on some curriculum with world history and trying to make it more culturally responsive. Um, and it came up, had some interesting conversations with colleagues about just centered around the whole idea of, how do you measure authentic learning in a way that's not centered in whiteness, right? I think so many times we get bogged down in like these rubrics that basically turn into checklists for people to just make their way through, and kids who know how to do school do very well with that, right? They can look at the rubric, they see what the requirements are, and they pound something out that meets it. Whether or not it's really good or really reflects true, authentic learning is irrelevant because it matches the rubric and things are checked off, and it becomes about that. So we kind of got into this whole conundrum of like how do you create something, a project, an outcome from a lesson that really is centered on authentic learning by students, where they get to explore something and go through and engage in critical thinking and then create a way to demonstrate their thinking, to make their thinking visible to you in such a way that's not really just checking off a list. And so kind of one of the things that we came up with that I think is pretty cool is we were trying to talk about how do you teach students about pre-imperial Africa and pre-contact indigenous peoples in the Americas. And we kind of got hooked around this idea of teaching through, that a lot of the history has been erased, and going into the detail about why is it that so much of the history of Africa and so much of the history of the Americas has been erased, and what remains. And a lot of what remains are material things. They're objects, they're tombs, they're monuments, they're buildings, they're things like this that have endured where some of the history has not. And so, we got this idea of, teaching like a story through an object, and how do historians approach this object. And so it's pretty cool. We're thinking about having them look at, learn about these civilizations through artifacts and through what remains, and then looking at, what is the story that's told based off of this artifact, and how do we know that's mostly subjective. Like how do you actually look at these artifacts, these things throughout history, and then build a story or build a narrative around that. And so we kind of came up with this idea of having them do it in their own life. Of they would select an object that represents something from their life that's significant, and it could be something like different views. It could be like a personal, it could be a family thing, it could be a local, regional thing, it could be a national thing, and it could be from any nation that they choose, that they've experienced or lived from, and they have this object, and then bringing it in and having a conversation with like a triad of fellow peers of like, here's my object, right? Let's say it's my cell phone case, right? Like with my wallet, and this is the object, and then the students who didn't bring that object would have to try to tell a story about me based on this, right? Based on what they know. So they go through it and they would look and be like, okay, you got a school district ID and a driver's license and some business cards and a credit card, and what story would they tell from that? And I'm really intrigued to see how that goes and how what students are going to say. But then also later allowing for the student that brought the object to be able to tell their full story. And so like something like that. Do you create a rubric for that? Do you say, okay, well, here's a checklist. You have to bring something. You have to have this piece of the story and this piece of the story, and answer this question. Or do you just allow them to engage in that inquiry process and to have those conversations? And then how do you translate that to how do you quantify that into a score or a grade? Because that's seems to be an important factor. So did learning take place, right? Did students learn in that? I would say yes. So how do you measure that? How do you measure how much they learned or what they, to what degree they learned that? A lot of times that's translating it to rubrics. So I don't know. I'm interested to continue to explore this and dig into it of how how to authentically assess learning without centering it on whiteness, and what does that look like in our classes. So we'll continue to explore it. Hopefully you do too. You figure it out. Let me know. Bye.